Folks, the movies are bad. They've been bad for a long time. It's hard to find an action movie that doesn't love a little bit of extrajudicial killing. It's even harder to find one that doesn't have some kind of relationship with the military-industrial complex in one way or another. Hollywood wants nothing more than to have some old guy from the Pentagon sit around on set telling them whether their fight scenes are realistic and how much he wants to glass Iran. It's not a secret, movies like Top Gun will gladly tell you about what a pleasure it was to work with the military. And this is not an accident. It's not just a convenient asset for the movie makers. This is a symbiotic relationship. The US Armed Forces care deeply about what the public thinks about them. Propaganda is a huge part of what they do. Noam Chomsky wrote in Manufacturing Consent that the US Air Force's public outreach program included 17 TV stations, 34 radio stations, 140 newspapers, 45,000 headquarters and unit news releases, 615,000 hometown news releases, 6,600 interviews, and fuck it, the quote is longer than my intro. It's on page 80. You can find the book for free on Google. Just pull it up. The point is, they do a lot, and it's not a new thing. Movies can be very easily used for political ends.
McBain to base. Under attack by commie Nazis.
It's not an earth-shattering observation, so part of me thinks I shouldn't even be here explaining this to you. But over the course of the pandemic, I had the displeasure of watching Peter Berg's 2013 biographical war thriller, Lone Survivor, which starred one of my favorite racist people in Hollywood, Marky Mark himself. My parents watched this shit and just memory hold it immediately. I promise you they don't remember they have ever seen this movie. But for me, it changed my brain chemistry. I became one standard deviation more annoying after I watched it. My eyes popped out of my head and steam came out of my ears when I found out that the movie was positively received by audiences and critics alike, and it was the highest grossing post 9/11 war movie at the time. I knew deep in my loins that this was the most evil movie I had ever seen. I then devoted hours of my life to reading the book it was based on, only to conclude that it was far more evil than I could have imagined. I then read like 10 books about Afghanistan just to better understand this country and unlock new ways to hate this film, this book, and everyone involved here. Friends, I am here to tell you that this is a movie about how war crimes are good and they are none of your business. I'm here to tell you that Lone Survivor is the wrongest movie ever made. I had originally written a lot about how the war in Afghanistan came about, how the Soviet invasion shaped the subsequent US occupation, and how this all paves the way for the events of Lone Survivor to take place, but frankly, this is a video about a Mark Wahlberg movie, so I'll save it for the next one, and instead jump straight to telling you the story as the book intended. In 2005, Marcus Luttrell was sent into the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan for Operation Redwing. His mission, along with his friends and fellow Navy SEALs, Matthew Axelson, Mike Murphy, and Danny Dietz, was to surveil a local Taliban leader named Ahmad Shah. The plan was to hide in the mountains above the town where they believed Shah to be, and if necessary, stay there for 4 days until they could get a clear visual of him. It's a long time to devote to a mission built around one guy. But this isn't just any guy. Shah is said to command an army of around 150 Taliban fighters and was known to be tight with Osama bin Laden. Closer to the mission launching, they received further word that Shah was expected to have somewhere between 80 and 200 men defending him. In his book, Luttrell says that Shah just keeps coming up and the size of his forces continue to get larger. In the adaptation, Matthew Axelson claims that Shah killed 20 Marines in the week before the operation. This all starts to weigh on Marcus, so he and his fellow SEALs grab an extra 3 magazines, giving them a total of 11 each. The team was then dropped off via helicopter to begin their mission. To avoid arousing suspicion from the local Taliban, they made 3 false inserts. Once Marcus and the team rappelled down, someone in the helicopter cut the rope behind them. Luttrell points this out as a pretty big mistake to make, but luckily Murphy found it and they covered it up with some foliage and moved along. After over 7 hours of hiking, they finally had a visual on the town they were sent to survey for Shah. The spot they settled for was great for observing the village, but pretty shitty as far as cover goes. As he got himself set up, Luttrell said that he could not move one muscle because if someone had long-range binoculars trained on them, they would be spotted. Luttrell notes that they couldn't be seen from below, and there was definitely no human being at eye level or above them, until a goat herder with an axe jumped off a log immediately above Luttrell. It was a chance encounter and a completely unintentional one. The farmer dropped the axe as soon as Marcus pulled his rifle on him. He was then joined by his herd of about 100 goats with bells on their necks, along with 2 other shepherds, one of whom the author estimates to be 14 years old. The older man confirmed upon questioning that they were not Taliban, but their vibes appeared to suggest they were not fans of the Americans either. And this is where things get really fucking weird. The team must come to a consensus on what to do with the farmers. The author correctly identifies the 3 of them as unarmed civilians according to the Geneva Convention. But he then claims that
the strict, correct military decision would still be to kill them without further discussion, because we could not know their intentions. How could we know if they were affiliated with a Taliban militia group?
He says that although these men showed no aggression, they also didn't offer or want the hand of friendship, which, to be clear, is not something covered in the Geneva Convention. I know I said I would tell the story as Luttrell did in his book, but I should note here that the movie actually gives the shepherds walkie-talkies, which they believe confirms them to be Taliban for whatever reason. It's a small detail, but I'll make sense of why it matters a little bit later. In the book's telling, the SEAL in charge of the operation, Mike Murphy, put it up to a vote. Axe said they should kill the men because letting them go would be a death sentence. Danny was indifferent and said he would go with whatever the others wanted. Luttrell said he thought that they had to kill them, but was interested in Murphy's thoughts. Murphy said that if they killed them, someone would find the bodies not long after, partially because of the massive goat herd, partially because they wouldn't return home to their families. He then says that when the Taliban inevitably find their bodies, they would make this a massive issue in the Afghan media, and the US will also pile onto the SEALs, who will ultimately be charged with murder. Murphy made it clear that if they killed the farmers, they would have to report it and face the charges that come their way. He gives Luttrell the final vote, saying that he will follow whatever decision he makes. Luttrell ultimately decided to spare their lives, a decision he would go on to regret. With that, the team released the farmers, who were then out of their line of sight within 19 minutes. It then took the SEALs between 40 minutes to an hour to cover the same ground. At this point, they opted to lay low for a while and hoped the Taliban had not been alerted, but if the Taliban was on their way, the SEALs hoped they were too well hidden to be found. After about an hour and 40 minutes, Mikey alerted Marcus that between 80 and 100 Taliban were coming down the mountain. Danny was instructed to call for backup if he could make their radio work, which it hadn't for much of the mission. When he's spotted by a member of the Taliban, Marcus draws first blood, killing him and allowing his team to start cutting down the enemy with precision. He remembers thinking that the estimate of 200 hostiles was a lot more accurate than the 80 minimum they had been advised. The firefight went on for what seemed like forever. It's unclear how many members of the Taliban they killed in the fight, but Luttrell says that after 40 minutes, there were still around 80 men coming after them. When Danny Dietz was shot through the neck and killed, the author estimates there were just 50 to 60 Taliban remaining. After being hit multiple times, Mike Murphy walked into the open to call headquarters on his cell phone and request reinforcements. After making the call, Marcus was unable to reach him and he was killed by the Taliban. At this point, Marcus estimates there are 50 Taliban remaining. After reaching Axe's location, the 2 men were blown apart from one another by grenades, knocking Marcus unconscious. Although Marcus did not see it happen, Axe would be killed shortly thereafter. When he came to, Marcus was able to break line of sight and hide. From his hiding place, he observed what he believed to be hundreds of Taliban looking for him. What he didn't know at this time was that Murphy's call to headquarters had actually gone through successfully. They responded by packing a helo to support the team, which was immediately shot down by the Taliban, killing everyone aboard, which Marcus calls the worst special ops catastrophe ever. At this point, Marcus is severely injured and dehydrated, wandering around the mountain looking for water. He believes he's being followed multiple times, but is able to keep them off his tail because he keeps accidentally falling off of cliffs. After briefly considering killing some civilians to steal their water, Marcus is ultimately found by a group of locals who, after a tense introduction, express to Marcus that they are not Taliban. The men take him back to their town and protect him from his enemies for several days. While staying with the village, Marcus befriends Mohammed Gulab, who he identifies as the son of a village elder. Gulab and the village band together to protect Marcus under a Pashtun hospitality law, which he describes as an unbreakable commitment to defend a wounded man to the death. This law goes beyond just one man and actually calls every member of the village to take part in the defense of the guest. After the village elder delivers a handwritten message from Luttrell to a local US military base, he is ultimately saved a few days later before the Taliban can get their hands on him. As portrayed on the big screen, it all plays like a Greek tragedy. Luttrell's Christian soul compelled him to not kill innocent civilians, and it led to the untimely deaths of 20 good men. The fact that Luttrell refused to fight the Taliban on their own brutal terms was ultimately his team's downfall. It's tragic, it's apolitical, war is hell, case closed. That is, if you actually believe this version of events. Which you shouldn't. The story that Marcus tells us appears to be factually wrong in at least 4 major ways.
Number 1!
To hear the author tell it, Ahmad Shah was a high-ranking Taliban officer responsible for killing 20 US Marines. He commanded a force of somewhere between 80 and 200 troops and was known to be a close associate of Osama bin Laden. The reality is far less exciting. Ahmad Shah was a small potatoes Taliban upstart with a fighting force of just 10 to 15 men. And Shah could not have killed 20 Marines in the week before the operation because the US only lost 2 soldiers in the entire country in that time. And although Shah had ties to Al-Qaeda, his association with bin Laden was an outright fabrication. Shah was specifically targeted because the US feared that he could ultimately grow to be significant someday, not because he was already a major player. Having a guy like Shah disappear wouldn't do the Taliban any favors, but it wasn't exactly a game changer. Prior to killing these 3 Navy SEALs, Ahmad Shah was essentially an unknown local Taliban aspirant.
Number
2. As Luttrell tells it, the most pivotal scene in our story occurs when the SEALs capture the goat herders and need to make a decision on what is to be done with them. Murphy, the man in charge, decides the team will hold a vote. As Luttrell tells it in his book, Axelson was immediately adamant that they should kill them, Dietz remained neutral, and Luttrell initially felt the same as Axe, but was open to hearing Murphy's perspective. Murphy then conveyed that killing the men would be criminal, and they would need to face the potential repercussions of their decision head-on before ultimately deferring to Marcus for the final decision. Luttrell claims that his Christian soul compelled him to let the men go, a decision he believes cost his friends their lives and would haunt him for years to come. Now, before I try to debunk this, it is worth mentioning that Luttrell and his team almost certainly had some kind of discussion about what their next move should be. Mohammed Gulab, the man who saved Luttrell, told Newsweek that other villagers had told him that such conversations occurred. However, we should be extremely skeptical about the author's claim that the lives of these goat herders will put up to a vote, as this isn't exactly common practice among the Navy SEALs. Luttrell's own Wikipedia has a quote from Navy Special Warfare Command spokesperson Steve Rue saying,
"This is the first time I've ever heard of anything put to a vote like that. In my 14 years of Navy experience, I've never seen or heard of anything like that."
Now, I don't love citing Wikipedia, but I'm working with a lot of dead links here, so get off me. But if that doesn't persuade you, Murphy's father said this version of events,
"It directly contradicts what he told Maureen, myself, and Michael's brother John in my kitchen. He said that Michael was adamant that civilians were going to be released, that he wasn't going to kill innocent people. Michael wouldn't put that up for a committee."
The easy response to this story is that Luttrell didn't have the heart to tell Murphy's family that their son was open to the idea of committing a war crime. But it doesn't seem like he expressed it anywhere before his book was written. Author Ed Derrick, who wrote his own book about the mission, stated in a blog post,
"Murphy placing something like this up to a vote almost certainly did not happen. I'm so certain that it did not happen that I'm going to just say that it did not happen. After reading this in Lone Survivor, I re-interviewed the Marines who had intimate knowledge of Luttrell's after-action report. All those I re-interviewed stated that nothing in the report said anything about a vote."
After rewatching the movie, I was surprised to see they actually retcon this entirely and have Murphy authoritatively decide that the SEALs will not be killing any civilians, which is a dramatic difference from the book, in which Luttrell is given the deciding vote, which Murphy follows. This change could be attributed to Peter Berg wanting to make a movie that wouldn't disrespect the dead SEALs, but it seems at least equally likely that this version of events is just more accurate than what we got in the book.
Number
3. In the version of the story that Luttrell provides, the team is unequivocally attacked because the team opted to free the goat herders who alerted the Taliban to their location. Luttrell states that had they not followed the rules of engagement, that his friends would still be alive today. But we actually have a surprising amount of alternative explanations for how they might have been found. Now, it's important to understand that the mission was originally planned by the Marines, who had intended to enter the mountains on foot. When the Navy SEALs took over, they insisted on going in via helicopter. The Marines believed that this was a bad idea because, I don't know if you know this, the mountains of Afghanistan are not a lively place. There is no nightlife in the Hindu Kush. There is a distinct lack of helicopters in the neighborhood. An entrance this conspicuous was bound to draw unwanted attention to the SEALs. So they offered a compromise. They would fly helicopters over the region for a few days so that the actual insert wouldn't seem so out of the ordinary. On the day itself, they would stage multiple false inserts as well to throw the locals off their scent. Despite these false inserts, Luttrell actually considers it a possibility they could have been seen at this point, as he notes seeing 2 sources of light that could have been lanterns or fires in the area. Muhammad Gulab, the villager that saved Luttrell, felt very strongly that this is why the team was compromised, saying that the Taliban and other locals had heard the SEALs come in and started searching for them in the morning. You might be thinking, yeah, but it would have been hours before morning, so how could they have possibly tracked them down? And hey, that's a great question. It would, in fact, be very difficult to track them down, unless they had left some evidence behind showing exactly where they had been dropped off, like a giant rope, for example. Now, Luttrell mentions in his book that the team was baffled as to why the rope had been severed when they got off the helicopter, but the idea here is that in a covert operation, you want to pull the rope back up so that there's no evidence of SEALs being dropped off, whereas in an active combat zone, you'd rather sever the rope so that the helicopter doesn't linger in the air for too long and get shot down. In this case, the mission planners had never actually discussed what should happen to the rope. Did they want to have the helicopter linger and risk being seen by the locals, or cut it and leave behind a huge piece of evidence? The crew chief, having not received direction otherwise, instinctively severed the rope because he was used to working direct action operations. Luttrell says that he and the team were ultimately able to hide the rope, but he neglects to mention how fucking huge this thing was. When tightly coiled, it would be around the size of 3 suitcases stacked on top of each other, making it difficult to hide and impossible to carry around with them. This was a big enough deal that Lieutenant Rob Long felt that the SEALs should have called off the mission then and there to avoid being compromised, but instead they continued on. As Luttrell tells the story himself, the SEALs bumbled their way through the mountains and repeatedly offered up opportunities to be seen by the enemy along the way. It's said that an enemy could have been easily lurking and watching them, and that after walking for about 4.5 miles, they nearly walked into someone's front yard. Because it was late, it's pretty unlikely the team could have been seen without night vision goggles, but not long afterwards, the team steps right out into the open and became unmissable. It's entirely possible that someone could have reported them to Shah and his men at some point during the trek, even if the rope had not been found. But whether it was a giant rope or these guys dicking around the mountains for hours, it seems as though the SEALs had been found out before they came across the goat herders. Lieutenant Long reported receiving word from the SEALs late in the morning of the 28th that the team had been soft compromised by the goat herders. Ed Derrick writes that,
Then, after what seemed along like just a few minutes from the soft compromise call, the next of the recon team's transmissions echoed through the room. Contact! We're hard compromised!
Now it's worth noting here that Derrick says that the gap between being found by the goat herders and found by the Taliban felt like a few minutes. Not necessarily that it was a few minutes, but this still feels drastically different from Marcus's account, which suggests that the team moved for about 40 minutes and then hid for an hour and 40 minutes before being found. Long's account appears to be supported by the locals. Remember how I mentioned that Muhammad Gulab had heard from other villagers that the Americans had discussed the fate of the goat herders? Those villagers heard that from the Taliban, who had already found the Americans at this point. They simply waited for the Americans to let their prisoners go before attacking. If this is true, and it seems likely, it refutes the entire thesis of the book, the goat herders could not have possibly ratted the SEALs out to the Taliban because they already found them. Marcus and his team killing these civilians would have done absolutely nothing to save anyone. They were dead the minute they let go of the rope, they just didn't know it yet.
Number
4. Once Marcus and his team were found by the Taliban, Luttrell would have you believe that they started picking bad guys off one by one. This is where you insert the sound of Patrick going, In the book, he says that the force was probably closer to the 200 than the 80 minimum that they had been advised. In subsequent speeches given after Lone Survivor came out, Luttrell would stick to the 200 number. Which is weird because he told the Today Show it was like 80 to 100.
You were attacked after you let them go.
Yes, sir.
By between 80 and 100 members of the Taliban.
Yes, sir.
And it was nasty.
Yes, sir.
And his after-action report immediately following the attack said it was just 20 to 30. And look, I get it. When the bullets are flying, things can get confusing, and it's understandable that one could overestimate exactly how many guys are shooting at you, but it does seem at least a little bit suspicious that Luttrell repeatedly contradicted himself by such a wide margin, right? Like, he jumped from 20 to 200. This alone is enough to make me skeptical of his figures here. But to make matters worse, Luttrell is once again contradicted by Mohammed Gulab, who heard the battle take place. According to Newsweek, Gulab said the battle was short-lived and scoffs at the idea that 35 Taliban were killed in the battle. Perhaps more surprisingly, Luttrell's numbers are also contradicted by Marines involved in the mission. Patrick Kinzer, a Marine infantry officer who helped plan the operation, called Luttrell's claims exaggerated nonsense, saying that there weren't 35 enemy fighters in all of Korangal Valley that day. According to author Ed Derrick, intelligence reports pegged the number of enemy combatants around 8 to 10. Videos shot by the Taliban during the attack, which were later analyzed and authenticated by US military intelligence, appeared to show just 8 men ambushing the SEALs, including Ahmad Shah. The generous way to interpret such a video would be to suggest that less enemy fighters could be seen because the SEALs had killed so many of them. However, Newsweek reports that
Andrew McManus, a former Marine colonel who helped draw up the mission and was on scene during the search and recovery effort for the dead SEALs, says there were no reports of any enemy casualties.
this is backed up by Gulab, who says that the villagers and the American military who searched the mountains after the attack found no evidence of any Taliban casualties. Gulab even claimed that when he found Luttrell, he still had 11 magazines of ammunition on him, which is exactly how many he claims he packed in Lone Survivor. This would appear to suggest that Marcus is not just exaggerating the scale of the fight that occurred, but that he did not participate in a fight at all. So to summarize the bullshit so far, he was wrong about the importance of the mission, he was wrong about how the story's pivotal conversation shook out, he was wrong about why he was attacked, he was wrong about how many people attacked him, and he was wrong about how the fight played out. Hell, now is as good a time as any to mention that he even got the name of the mission wrong. It's Operation Redwings, dipshit. Not Red Wing. 2 words, plural. Like the hockey team. How do you put this on the cover of your book? Multiple editions. How do you... didn't anyone think... Why wouldn't you... Fuck it, it doesn't matter. Because as mind-numbingly stupid as that is, I need to address why this book was written so you can understand just how wrong this thing can get. It's easy to look at this story and all of its glaring holes and just conclude that this is about one sad man looking at the most traumatic time of his life and trying to save some face or something. And it's entirely possible that that's exactly what happened here. But I actually think that this book and its purposes are a bit more sinister than that. This isn't just about protecting Marcus's reputation as a SEAL, it's about war crimes and how you should feel about them. It doesn't take long for Luttrell to start whining about how much more brutal US forces need to be in Afghanistan. Less than 40 pages into his book, he begins to complain about the, quote, ever-intrusive rules of engagement.
They are very specific. We may not open fire until we are fired upon or have positively identified our enemy and have proof of his intentions.
He thinks this is all very gallant, but he immediately counters these rules by saying, but what if we'd been fired upon in the previous days of patrol? And are very nearly exhausted and maybe slightly scared. And I'm not gonna beat around the bush on this one. This is fucking awesome. He can't even commit to making the case that he's a small bean or whatever. He can't just say, what if I'm scared? He has to qualify it. What if I'm a little scared? Maybe. I mean, like, if you're gonna go down this route, you have to go all in. What if they're scared? What if they're petrified? You don't get to kill anyone because you're maybe slightly scared. Get real, fuck off, dude. This is when Luttrell lays the deaths of the 3 SEALs at the feet of the 3 goat herders that he claims to have spared, saying that,
I can say from first-hand experience that those rules of engagement cost the lives of 3 of the finest US Navy SEALs who have ever served. They would not have died right then, and in my view, would almost certainly have been alive today.
it's a pretty bold claim, and as discussed, almost certainly a lie, but it's also a small piece of this book's campaign against the concept of war crimes and the liberal media at large. The author claims that
the entire business of modern war crimes, as identified by the liberal wings of politics in the media, began in Iraq and have been running downhill ever since.
it's possible that if the author had skimmed a book about Vietnam, he might get the vibe that the US was receiving criticism for committing war crimes long before the US invaded Iraq on incredibly flimsy grounds, which, by the way, Luttrell unequivocally defends in this book. He actually takes on the impossible task of trying to convince the reader that Iraq had direct ties to Al-Qaeda, something so ridiculous that even Wikipedia calls it a conspiracy theory. But this whining about liberals is a recurring theme throughout the book. Every time Luttrell starts talking about killing innocent people, he starts complaining about the liberal media's feelings on it, and suggesting they are complicit in the enemy's attempts to make the war effort look inhumane. He writes that,
if we did shoot a couple of them, they would be on their cell phones with a speed of 10,000 gigabytes, direct to the Arab television station Al Jazeera.
and that,
The media in the States would crucify us. Was there ever a greater uproar than the one that broke out over Abu Ghraib?
and look, I can sympathize to some extent with the idea that in the fog of war, soldiers can at times be put in an ambiguous situation where they might need to make split-second decisions that could ultimately lead to good, innocent people being killed. That's war. But Luttrell gives the game away here by equating these split-second decisions with the state-sponsored abuse, torture, and humiliation of prisoners at Abu Ghraib that were so egregious the US couldn't even argue that these abuses did not violate the Geneva Convention, and instead tried to argue the Geneva Convention just didn't apply to them at all, which was wrong and stupid, and they lost in court because of it. Even when we reach the turning point of our story, when Marcus is faced with a choice to kill 3 innocent civilians or to let them go and risk the lives of his entire team, the author spends less time focusing on his Christian inclination towards mercy, and instead makes his decision because he's worried about what the libs will say about him if he kills this 14-year-old boy, writing,
Was I afraid of these guys? No. Was I afraid of the possible buddies in the Taliban? No. Was I afraid of the liberal media back in the USA? Yes.
After deciding to spare the farmers, he laments the decision and says,
It was the stupidest, most southern-fried, lame-brained decision I had ever made in my life. I turned into a fucking liberal. A half-assed, no-logic nitwit. All heart, no brain, and the judgment of a jackrabbit.
I mean, I can keep going and tell you about all the times that Luttrell complains about liberals for being too hard on war crimes, but it happens so often that it's just a waste of time. He throws this in throughout the book, seemingly without thinking, and in doing so, he lays out a pretty alarming contradiction that he never attempts to grapple with. Early on in the book, Luttrell asserts that the libs should stay out of deciding who he should be allowed to kill because
We know about bad guys, what they do, and often who they are.
But he doesn't actually believe this, because he goes on to admit over 100 pages later that not only can he not discern good guys from bad, neither can anyone else.
In this kind of a terrorist insurgent warfare, no one can tell who's a civilian and who's not. So what's the point of framing rules that cannot be comprehensively carried out by anyone? Rules that are unworkable because half the time no one knows who the goddamned enemy is.
This is a take that the average person would be repulsed by. That's why they needed to craft a story in which the only way to save our brave heroes would be to kill unarmed civilians. The reader is supposed to come away from this book thinking, wow, war is a lot more complicated than I thought. Maybe I should back off a little bit. But Luttrell doesn't just want you to choose to stay out of it. He thinks that these kinds of stories are not your business to begin with. He says so when he complains about liberals
blathering on about the public's right to know. Well, in the view of most Navy SEALs, the public does not have the right to know. Not if it means placing our lives in unnecessary peril because someone in Washington is driving himself mad worrying about the human rights of some cold-hearted terrorist fanatic who would kill us as soon as look at us.
And this is why this story was written. This is what they wanted the audience to think about war. That what happens overseas is none of your business because you couldn't possibly understand how hard it is for the soldiers, like Marcus. They don't have it quite as bad as Jews during the Holocaust, but it's close enough that the author thought to make the comparison. And Luttrell believes that this hate is completely unwarranted. He believes that US forces have been incredibly restrained in their treatment of the enemy. But Luttrell also believes very strongly that the way to ultimately defeat a ruthless enemy like the Taliban is to fight them on their own terms, whether you like it or not. And maybe on a battle level scale, this could be true. Like if you're fighting someone and they're willing to pull your hair and gouge your eyes, you might need to match that energy if you want to win. But that's not war. In the entirety of this book, the author never grapples with the fact that war is about people. So long as there are a significant number of people that want to keep fighting you, you cannot win a war. You can continue your occupation, and you can delay the inevitable, but you can't actually win. We need to understand why, in spite of the Taliban's brutal theocratic dictatorship, people continued to join their cause and lose faith in the Americans. It's because there was one thing that continued to drive people back to them. The Taliban resurged because the United States could not stop capturing and killing innocent civilians. The exact thing that this book wants to see more of. Now, this video is entirely too long for what it is, so I can't devote anywhere near as much time to this as it deserves, but trust me when I say that these stories of American excesses are not rare. There are a lot more examples that I'm able to share, but the absolute state of the US occupation can best be understood by reading Anand Gopal's book, No Good Men Among the Living. In it, he illustrates the point that US forces would often incarcerate Afghans indiscriminately, even if they were staunchly anti-Taliban and collaborated with the Americans. Gopal tells the story of Dr. Hazfullah, an anti-Taliban government official in Zermatt province who was sent to Guantanamo Bay after he was falsely accused of terrorism by the corrupt head of police, Chief Mujahid, who would also be sent to Guantanamo Bay soon after. The local security chief Naeem, who was also fiercely anti-Taliban, was also sent to Guantanamo after being falsely accused of terrorist sympathies by his rival, Mullah Qasim. Qasim, who actually had terrorist ties, was able to avoid being captured by the Americans as they instead grabbed another Afghan of the same name and shipped his ass to Guantanamo. And to top it all off, when the pro-American commander, Samud Khan, was found out to be a double agent, he was sent to Bagram prison, while one of the 12-year-old boys that he and his men would sexually abuse was sent to Guantanamo, where he would be the youngest detainee. I don't intend for this to be an exhaustive list of how the US fucked with local Afghan politics. This is literally just a handful of errors carried out in a short stretch of time in the Zermatt province alone. Further inspection of Guantanamo as a whole would tell you that one inmate was accused of being a supporter of Ahmad Shah Abdul Khan, CIA, Mujahideen, 9 Taliban shared with Taliban, already an Afghan bus driver, which after no reason for keeping him, he stayed for 3 more years. And this says nothing about the indiscriminate killing carried out by US drones, which killed an obscene amount of civilians relative to enemy combatants. And beyond the death from above, US forces would kill you in your own home too. Journalist Lindsay Billing dug into a zero-unit squad who conducted night raids in Afghanistan on behalf of the CIA and found that across hundreds of night raids, she was able to identify at least 452 civilian deaths over a 4-year period. Now, 452 should be an alarming number of innocent people to kill, but I can't stress enough that this was attributable to just one of 4 zero-unit death squads over just a 4-year period of a 20-year occupation. All this to say that the US was hardly handcuffed by the rules of engagement, and this consistent humiliation wore on the Afghan people, and in many cases it turned them against the Americans. And it didn't need to be this way. Some US forces did reach out to the Afghans and treat them as a people to be invested in rather than eliminated. I don't want to make it sound like the US occupation was all sunshine and rainbows. Believe me, I was not a fan, but it happened sometimes. This is the fundamental difference between counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. In theory, at least. The former seeks to kill whoever needs to be killed, and the latter is supposed to win people over to your cause. To be effective, though, this requires a zero-tolerance policy towards civilian casualties, as just one can ruin weeks or months of humanitarian work. In one particularly relevant instance that I found, a local Marine lieutenant named Matt Bartels was introduced to a local Afghan who told him through a translator that although he was typically scared to approach Americans because of previous negative experiences, he had heard about the Marines' work with the local girls' school and wanted to be friends. It's possible that if that Afghan had not seen that humanitarian work and instead lost friends to American forces, that he would keep his distance or even provide aid to the Taliban instead. But he didn't do that. Instead, he put his life on the line to help American troops in spite of the threat to his life posed by the Taliban. That Afghan's name was Mohammed Gulab, and he saved Marcus Luttrell's life in this story. And that's the frustrating part about the narrative the author chose to tell here. If you want to tell an inspiring story that gasses up the US military and casts the occupation of Afghanistan in a positive light, you would tell the story of Mohammed Gulab, an Afghan who saw that the Americans maybe could make a positive difference in his community, so he put his own life and that of his family on the line to save a complete stranger to him. He stood up to the Taliban, and for years he was terrorized for it. His nephew was shot in the head and killed because of it. But the goal of this story was not to inspire or inform, it was to spin a very specific narrative. That's why, while all of this was happening to Mohammed Gulab, Marcus Luttrell was back in America peddling a book about how the United States needed to commit more war crimes. But why? Like, would he lie about all these details just to make himself feel better about how things shook out? Maybe, but Marcus didn't write this book at all. The Navy commissioned Patrick Robinson to write it, and they did so within weeks of Operation Redwing's coming to a close. He wrote the entirety of the book based on unrecorded interviews with Luttrell while he was away in Iraq. This is not something you do when you are concerned with the facts on the ground. It's something you do when you only need the gist of a story to craft your narrative. This is why the book has such glaring errors, like the name of the operation and Shah's kill count, because the guy who would have known that stuff was halfway across the world when the book was actually being written. Now, Robinson claims that he was chosen because the Navy felt he demonstrated a strong knowledge of the SEALs in his fiction writing. If this is true at all, it's just half the reason. He was brought on to tell a fictional version that would paint Luttrell as a hero. He was brought on to push a political message. He specifically crafted a story in which the deaths of some good old American boys could be laid at the feet of innocent Afghan civilians despite considerable evidence suggesting otherwise. This is why the novel positions Marcus as the man who casts the deciding vote against killing the goat herders, because the fact that he has now changed his mind and supports killing them makes the narrative all the more persuasive. This story tells the reader that rules of engagement be damned, sometimes war crimes are okay. And if it started and ended there, I wouldn't waste so much time talking about this. But this is not a fringe opinion held by a ghostwriter gone rogue. Some American soldiers in Iraq would tell you the same thing, with one telling Seymour Hersh,
We're going to have to play their game. Guerrilla versus guerrilla. Terrorism versus terrorism. We've got to scare the Iraqis into submission.
This is an opinion held all the way up to the highest reaches of American power. Jimmy Carter, the guy that's always trotted out as the most moral post-World War II president, suggested that William Calley, who was convicted of killing 22 civilians in the My Lai massacre, was a scapegoat, whose conviction was a blow to troop morale. And it goes without saying that conservatives are the worst offenders of all, with Ben Shapiro writing stuff about how the Democrats critical of George Bush's war in Iraq should be charged with sedition. And I cannot stress enough that this is not just a case of Robinson agreeing with those guys out of happenstance. He was handpicked by the Navy for a reason. They reviewed this book for accuracy, of which there was none, and gave it a green light for publishing. And that is why this is the wrongest book of all time. Not because it leaves out important context or lies about the significance of the mission or how it happened, but because this is a book that comes straight from the military-industrial complex to convince you that the reason the US is not winning wars is because they need to kill more innocent people. Alright, I've spent at least 2 years thinking about all the ways I wanted to shit on this movie and the book that spawned it from hell, but I had no idea it would get this long and I'd have to leave so much out. I didn't get to talk about the fact that when the village elder sauntered over to the nearest US military base to tell them about finding Marcus, The Marines sat with him and drank tea before planning to have him walk them to the location, only for the Navy SEALs to black bag him and drag his ass to another location for interrogation, despite being fully cooperative. I didn't get a chance to talk about the way that Luttrell continues to talk about Gulab as though they have a brotherly relationship to this day, despite Gulab publicly calling him out for lying and abandoning him all the way back in 2016. I didn't get to talk about the fact that Joe Rogan had Luttrell on his podcast in March of 2021, despite all these lies being readily accessible for years. And I decided not to delve into this stuff because, well, number one, I'm not H-bomber guy, I don't have the clout for that, but also because these more minor, personal grievances I have with everyone involved here is nothing compared to the American exceptionalism that this book represents and how many innocent people these ideas have killed across the globe. And make no mistake, I'll keep watching this garbage, and you can too, but for the love of God, don't ever let the people that direct movies like Hancock and Battleship inform your politics.